I froze completely still when I overheard my sisters-in-laws whispering that stepping foot into our home had been a massive mistake. They laughed quietly, judging every corner of the room and assuming we were entirely beneath their elite social status. But they had absolutely no idea they were missing one crucial piece of the story. Just hours later, a shocking truth was revealed, one that dealt a devastating and permanent blow to their unearned pride. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family who underestimated your worth. My name is Nia and I am 32 years old. I stood perfectly still, completely hidden behind the massive marble island, in the kitchen of my parents' extravagant Atlanta suburban home holding a heavy silver tray of freshly baked oysters. The air in the room was thick with the scent of expensive catering and the suffocating weight of family expectations. Just on the other side of the decorative partition, I could hear the unmistakable voices of Beverly and Sterling. They were my younger sister Jasmine's incredibly wealthy and unbearably pretentious in-laws. They believed they were alone and their true colors were showing in the most vibrant and ugly ways imaginable. Beverly let out a harsh, mocking laugh that grated against my ears as she criticized the interior design of the house. I heard her tell Sterling that this place was nothing more than a glorified Section 8 housing project masquerading as a luxury estate. She expressed utter disgust that their precious son Trey had married into a family with no real Bull legacy, no generational wealth, and no true understanding of high society. Sterling chuckled in agreement, adding that my parents were trying entirely too hard to fit into a world they fundamentally did not understand and could never truly belong to. They stood there in a home they had been invited to as honored guests, openly mocking the very people who were bending over backward to accommodate their every whim. My knuckles turned stark white as I gripped the edges of the silver tray, fighting every natural instinct to march around the corner and demand they leave the premises immediately. But I kept my composure because reacting with anger would only give them the satisfaction of proving their point about our supposed lack of class and refinement. As I stood there gripping the tray, my mind raced through the bitter and hilarious irony of the entire situation. Beverly and Sterling were standing in a sprawling 5-bedroom colonial home with a perfectly manicured lawn and a heated swimming pool, judging my parents, David and Brenda, for their financial status. But the undeniable truth, the secret that I had kept buried for years, was that David and Brenda did not actually buy this magnificent house. They did not have the capital, the credit, or the business acumen to afford a property in this exclusive zip code. I was the one who had secretly paid off the entire mortgage through an incredibly complex blind trust. I orchestrated the whole financial maneuver just to give my parents the ultimate black excellence facade they so desperately craved and constantly posted about on their carefully curated social media accounts. I wanted them to have peace of mind and the social standing they thought was so vital to their happiness. Yet despite my massive financial contribution to their comfortable lifestyle, they continued to treat me like a lowly unmarried bookkeeper who possessed no ambition and brought no value to the family name. In their eyes, I was just the plain older daughter who pushed papers and balanced spreadsheets for a meager salary. They had absolutely no clue that the blind trust paying for the roof over their heads was entirely funded by my own aggressive investments and strategic acquisitions. They paraded around the country club, boasting about their supposed real estate savvy, while simultaneously looking down on me for not securing a wealthy husband or an elite social circle. I had literally bought the very stage upon which they performed their daily theatrical display of wealth and success, yet I was constantly relegated to the role of an embarrassing extra who was only tolerated out of biological obligation. The sheer audacity of their ignorance was staggering, but I had learned long ago that maintaining my stealth wealth was far more valuable than seeking validation from people who only measured worth by the designer logos on a handbag or the prestige of a spouse's last name. I took a deep breath and prepared to face the evening, knowing exactly who held the real power in this house. The heavy wooden front door swung open with a dramatic flourish, signaling the highly anticipated arrival of the golden couple. Jasmine, my 28-year-old sister, and her husband Trey walked into the foyer loudly announcing their presence and expecting the customary red carpet treatment they always received. Jasmine was draped in head-to-toe designer clothing, carrying a limited edition handbag that she made sure everyone noticed immediately. Trey trailed slightly behind her, wearing a tailored suit and an expression of profound boredom mixed with arrogant entitlement. I watched from the kitchen entrance as my parents, David and Brenda, practically tripped over themselves to greet the pair. They fawned over Trey, treating him like absolute royalty, asking if the drive from his prestigious neighborhood had been too stressful and offering to take his coat with an eagerness that was honestly embarrassing to witness. Jasmine soaked up the attention like a sponge, her eyes scanning the room until they landed on me. Without even a simple greeting or a basic acknowledgement of my existence as a human being, she immediately launched into giving me orders. She snapped her fingers and demanded that I fix Trey a drink right away, speaking to her older sister with the exact same tone and cadence one might use when addressing a hired maid who was slacking on the job. She specified his favorite brand of expensive bourbon and insisted I ensure the ice was perfectly clear, complaining that the last time I served him, the presentation was utterly inadequate. The sheer disrespect in her voice was palpable, but my parents simply smiled adoringly at her, completely ignoring the degrading way she was treating me in front of the entire gathering. They were so desperate to maintain their proximity to Trey's family wealth and social standing that they would happily let Jasmine treat me like the household staff if it kept her and her husband happy and comfortable. I stood there observing this toxic family dynamic unfold exactly as it had 100 times before. The entire room revolved around the illusion of their importance, while my actual contributions to their comfortable existence remained completely unrecognized and unappreciated. I did not argue with Jasmine or point out the blatant disrespect in her command. I simply smiled a cold, tightly controlled smile that conveyed absolutely nothing of the storm brewing beneath the surface. I gracefully handed the heavy silver tray of hors d'oeuvres to my mother, who took it without a word of thanks, and I smoothly turned my back on the entire ridiculous spectacle. I walked away from the crowded foyer, pulling my phone from the pocket of my unassuming slacks. The time for quietly observing and protecting their fragile egos had officially passed. I opened my encrypted messaging application and navigated to the secure chat with my elite wealth management and legal team. My fingers moved swiftly across the digital keyboard as I typed a single definitive directive. Initiate code red on the Sterling accounts. It is time. I hit send and watched the delivery confirmation appear on the screen. In that exact moment, the entire nature of the conflict shifted fundamentally. It moved away from the realm of petty, passive-aggressive family insults and trivial dinner party slights into a very real, very dangerous, high-stakes financial arena. The text message was not a bluff. It was the activation of a meticulously planned financial strategy designed to completely dismantle the arrogant foundation upon which the Sterling family had built their entire identity. I had spent months acquiring their distressed assets, quietly gathering the financial leverage necessary to hold their future entirely in my hands. They thought they were dealing with an unremarkable, uneducated disappointment, who could be mocked and ordered around without any fear of retaliation. They were completely unaware that they were actually taunting the very person who now possessed the power to bankrupt them with a single signature. The ticking time bomb of my hidden power had been armed, and the countdown had officially begun. I slipped the phone back into my pocket, feeling a profound sense of calm wash over me. The evening was no longer a dreadful family obligation. It had transformed into the final act of a beautifully orchestrated play, where I was the only one who knew the script. I took one last moment in the quiet hallway to center myself, preparing to walk back into the dining room and play my assigned role of the obedient failure for just a little while longer. The sheer anticipation of the impending revelation was almost intoxicating. The entire family eventually transitioned from the foyer and living areas, moving into the formal dining room for the main course of the evening. The visual hierarchy of our family dynamic was immediately and blatantly established entirely through the strategic seating arrangement my mother Brenda had carefully planned. She had positioned Sterling and Beverly at the absolute heads of the long mahogany table, elevating them to the positions of highest honor and respect in a house they did not even own. Jasmine and Trey were seated directly next to them in the prime locations where they could easily dominate the conversation and bask in the collective admiration of my parents. David and Brenda sat adjacent to the golden couple, their faces fixed in permanent expressions of eager approval. As for me, I was predictably relegated to a small, uncomfortable wooden chair situated at the very far end of the table, right next to the swinging door that led into the kitchen. I was positioned exactly like an afterthought, an unwanted guest who was only there to facilitate the serving of food and the clearing of plates. Every time the kitchen door swung open, a draft of cold air hit my back, a constant physical reminder of my isolated and diminished status within this family structure. They had literally placed me as close to the exit and the service area as possible, visually communicating to everyone present that I was not considered a true equal at this gathering. I took my seat quietly, unfolding my cloth napkin and placing it on my lap, watching the way the candlelight reflected off the expensive crystal glasses that my mother had purchased using the very funds I had anonymously provided to her accounts. The glaring disparity in how we were treated was not an accident. It was a deliberate choice by my parents to showcase their allegiance to the Sterling family's perceived wealth and prestige. I sat in my isolated corner, perfectly content to observe their shallow interactions, while knowing the absolute truth about the financial reality they were all so desperate to hide. It did not take long for Jasmine to initiate the first targeted attack of the evening, seamlessly blending her boasting with a thinly veiled insult directed squarely at me. She leaned across the table, her designer jewelry clinking loudly and brightly, announced to the entire group how excited she and Trey were about their upcoming alumni gala at their prestigious historically Black university. She went on at length about the exclusive guest list, the expensive table they had sponsored, and the custom gown she was having tailored specifically for the event. She made sure everyone at the table understood how vital this gala was to maintaining their elite social standing and networking with the most powerful figures in Atlanta's high society. Then she turned her gaze directly toward my end of the table, a look of faux pity masking the malicious intent in her eyes. She asked me in a voice dripping with condescension if my little accounting job would possibly allow me to request some time off next weekend. She did not want to know if I wanted to attend the gala or if I had any exciting plans of my own. Instead, she publicly asked if I could make myself available to house sit and babysit their demanding purebred dog while they attended their luxurious event. She framed the request as if she were doing me a massive favor by giving me something to do with my pathetic, empty weekends. She even added that she would pay me a few extra dollars so I could maybe treat myself to a nice dinner for once. The sheer audacity of asking a grown woman to cancel her life to act as an unpaid pet sitter simply because she assumed my career was meaningless was staggering. My parents nodded along, acting as if this was a perfectly reasonable and generous offer from their successful younger daughter, completely ignoring the blatant disrespect embedded in every single word Jasmine spoke. I looked at Jasmine's smug expression, perfectly capturing the essence of someone who believed her worth was entirely tied to her husband's last name and her university alumni status. She had absolutely no idea that the little accounting job she was so openly mocking was actually the executive leadership of an acquisition firm that could buy and sell her husband's entire family legacy before breakfast. I did not offer an immediate verbal response to Jasmine's incredibly insulting request. Instead, I slowly reached for my crystal water goblet, picking it up and taking a long, deliberate sip of the iced water. In that brief moment of silence, a powerful flashback wove its way through my mind, pulling me back to the exact origin of this deep-seated family stigma. I vividly remembered the terrifying day I sat in my parents' living room at 20 years old and told them I was dropping out of my prestigious university program. I had realized that the traditional academic path was not going to help me build the massive tech acquisitions firm I had meticulously planned out in my dorm room. When I shared my vision with David and Brenda, their reaction was swift and devastatingly cruel. They immediately cut me off financially, revoking every single dollar of support and branding me the ultimate family disgrace. They told me I would end up with nothing while simultaneously increasing their financial contributions to fund Jasmine's lavish sorority lifestyle and endless social events. They kicked me out and told me to figure it out on my own. And that is exactly what I did. I spent the next 12 years building my company in total secrecy, mastering the art of stealth wealth. I created a multi-million-dollar private equity empire completely under the radar, named Apex Citadel Partners. I specialized in acquiring distressed debt and liquidating failing commercial portfolios, all while maintaining a cheap apartment and a mundane wardrobe to keep my family completely off the scent. I allowed my family to continue believing their false narrative about my total failure, while I quietly amassed a fortune that eclipsed anything they could ever dream of achieving. I brought my focus back to the present moment, lowering my water glass and returning my attention to the dining room table where my family continued to look at me with varying degrees of pity and disdain. The memory of their harsh rejection no longer brought me pain. It only reinforced the profound satisfaction I felt, knowing how brilliantly I had outmaneuvered their narrow expectations. Every insult they hurled at me now was just another reminder of their profound ignorance and my ultimate triumph. Before I could formulate a polite but firm decline to Jasmine's babysitting offer, Beverly decided it was the perfect moment to chime in and escalate the conflict to an entirely new level of toxicity. She weaponized her classism with the precision of a seasoned socialite seeking to inflict maximum emotional damage. Leaning back in her plush chair, she looked directly at David and Brenda and asked them in a voice loud enough for the entire house to hear exactly how they managed to cope with the profound embarrassment of having such an unmarried, uneducated, and unaccomplished daughter bringing down their family image. She stated that in her elite circles, a child who failed to secure a degree and a prominent marriage was considered an absolute tragedy that reflected poorly on the parents' entire bloodline. Instead of defending me or shutting down this horrific insult directed at their own flesh and blood, my father David completely folded under the pressure of Beverly's perceived authority. He let out a nervous, obsequious laugh and actually apologized to Beverly for my presence. He stated that they had tried their hardest to instill ambition in me, but some people simply lack the drive and intellectual capacity to succeed in the real world. Brenda nodded vigorously in agreement, adding that they prayed for me every day, but had accepted that I would never reach Jasmine's level of sophistication. Trey smirked openly at my father's pathetic display of submission, while Jasmine looked absolutely triumphant, basking in the glow of my public humiliation. He openly validated her cruel assessment, sacrificing my dignity just to keep the peace and maintain the favor of his arrogant in-laws. He threw me under the bus without a second thought, prioritizing the approval of a financially ruined woman over the basic humanity of his oldest daughter. I sat perfectly still, absorbing the full weight of their combined betrayal. I slowly and deliberately set my water glass down on the table, the soft clink of the crystal against the wood cutting through the tension in the room. I did not shed a tear, and I did not raise my voice. The true battle had officially begun, and I was holding an arsenal of financial destruction that they could not even begin to comprehend. The sheer cowardice of my father's apology was the final necessary confirmation that this family was beyond redemption. They had willingly chosen their superficial alliances over their own child, and in doing so they had completely forfeited any right to my mercy or protection in the financial slaughter that was about to unfold. I looked around the table at their smug, satisfied faces, knowing their artificial world was about to end. The suffocating atmosphere in the dining room took a sharp turn when Beverly decided to escalate her performance of wealth and superiority. She leaned forward in her plush velvet chair, completely dominating the conversation with loud boasts about her exclusive country club memberships and the prestigious charity boards she supposedly chaired. She waved her hands wildly in the air, emphasizing how much she despised the new money crowd that was ruining Atlanta society. In the middle of a particularly aggressive hand gesture, her heavily jeweled wrist struck the delicate stem of her crystal wine glass. The glass tipped over with a sharp clink, sending a massive tidal wave of dark crimson liquid cascading directly off the polished mahogany table and straight onto the intricate Persian rug resting beneath our feet. The deep red stain instantly began to spread across the pristine silk fibers, creating a stark visual contrast against the muted tones of the dining room floor. Anyone with a shred of basic human decency or basic manners would have immediately apologized for causing such severe damage to their hosts' property. Beverly, however, did absolutely no such thing. She merely glanced down at the spreading crimson puddle with a look of mild inconvenience, as if a stray leaf had blown onto her expensive designer shoe. She did not offer a single word of apology to my mother, Brenda, who was watching the scene unfold with barely concealed panic. Instead, Beverly casually adjusted her expensive diamond necklace and shifted her gaze directly toward my end of the table. She looked at me with the exact same dismissive authority she used when speaking to the valets at her supposedly elite country club. She raised her right hand perfectly in my direction and loudly snapped her manicured fingers twice. The sharp sound echoed through the silent dining room, cutting through the tension like a heavy physical blow. She looked me dead in the eye and commanded me to be a dear and fetch some club soda, immediately before the expensive rug was permanently ruined. She spoke with absolute certainty, fully expecting the plain, unaccomplished daughter of the house to drop everything, rush to the kitchen and fall to her knees to scrub the floor at the behest of a superior guest. The sheer entitlement radiating from her posture was breathtaking, demonstrating exactly how she viewed my existence within this household and this space. My mother, Brenda, let out a loud, dramatic gasp the moment the dark red liquid made contact with the expensive rug beneath the dining table. She was absolutely terrified of upsetting Beverly and ruining the fragile social connection they had worked so incredibly hard to build with the Sterling family. Brenda completely ignored the glaring fact that her wealthy guest had just carelessly damaged a beautiful piece of decor without offering a single shred of an apology. Instead, she turned her panic entirely on me instantly, weaponizing her parental authority to appease the arrogant woman sitting at the head of the table. She commanded me in a sharp, frantic voice to go fetch the cleaning supplies from the pantry right away. She ordered me to get down on my hands and knees and scrub the delicate silk fibers before the stain could set permanently. She spoke to me with a level of frantic disrespect that clearly communicated her willingness to sacrifice my basic human dignity simply to keep the peace with her elite in-laws. My father, David, did not attempt to intervene or defend me from this degrading treatment. He leaned back in his chair, taking a slow sip of his own untouched wine, and muttered under his breath, loud enough for Trey and Jasmine to hear. He callously remarked that I should hurry up and be useful for once in my entire life, since I clearly had absolutely nothing else going for me. His words were a brutal reinforcement of the completely false narrative they had constructed about my existence. They both fully expected me to blindly submit to this humiliating public display of servitude without a single word of protest or resistance. Just as I had done so many times in the painful past very long ago, I did not move a single muscle to comply with their degrading demands. I sat perfectly still in my small, uncomfortable chair, completely ignoring my mother's frantic orders and my father's cruel muttering. The entire table stared at me, waiting for the obedient failure they thought they knew to jump up and fetch the cleaning supplies like a well-trained servant. Instead, I slowly raised my head and locked eyes directly with Beverly, completely refusing to submit to her arrogant display of power. The room fell into an incredibly tense hush as my silence stretched on for several heavy, agonizing seconds. I calmly placed my hands flat on the polished mahogany table, projecting an aura of absolute, unshakable authority that immediately unsettled everyone present. I kept my voice perfectly level and entirely devoid of emotion as I finally broke the stifling silence. That rug you just carelessly ruined is a genuine hand-knotted silk Isfahan woven with meticulous precision and currently valued at exactly $12,000, I stated, watching her smug expression begin to falter slightly. I did not break eye contact as I continued speaking, letting my words land with the heavy, devastating impact of a perfectly executed strike. And the dark red liquid you just thoughtlessly wasted across those delicate fibers is a beautifully aged 2018 vintage Opus 1, I added, tilting my head ever so slightly to the side. I let that information sink into the quiet room, watching David and Brenda exchange nervous, confused glances as they tried to understand how their supposedly uneducated daughter knew the precise value of these luxury items. I took a slow, deliberate breath before delivering the ultimate crushing blow to her carefully maintained facade of generational wealth and untouchable status. I leaned forward, just a fraction of an inch, making sure my voice carried clearly to every single corner of that massive, incredibly lavish dining room, which, considering the undeniable fact that your highly touted exclusive black card was incredibly publicly and humiliatingly declined at the Neiman Marcus jewelry counter at exactly 9:15 this morning. Mrs. Sterling is something you clearly cannot afford to replace, I said, allowing a small, razor-sharp smirk to form on my lips. I delivered the deeply personal and highly confidential financial information with the casual indifference of someone reading a mundane grocery list. I watched with profound satisfaction as the sheer reality of my statement hit her like a runaway freight train, completely destroying the arrogant illusion she had spent the entire evening desperately trying to force upon my clueless family. The power dynamic shifted permanently in that very exact moment, bringing absolute and total victory. Closer right now today, definitively. The entire dining room instantly plunged into a dead, horrifying silence that felt so incredibly thick you could practically cut it with a knife. Beverly sat completely frozen in her ornate chair, her mouth hanging wide open in absolute stunned disbelief, as her face drained of all color, turning a sickly shade of pale gray. Her meticulously crafted mask of superior wealth and untouchable prestige had been violently ripped away, leaving her exposed and deeply humiliated in front of the very people she had spent the entire evening mocking and looking down upon. Beside her, Trey abruptly shot up from his seat, practically kicking his chair backward, as his face contorted with sudden, unbridled rage and profound embarrassment. He slammed his fists down onto the table, causing the silverware to rattle loudly as he aggressively demanded to know exactly how a pathetic, glorified calculator like me could possibly possess such highly sensitive information regarding his mother's private banking records. His voice cracked slightly, betraying the underlying panic that was quickly replacing his usual arrogant swagger. Jasmine looked utterly terrified, frantically glancing between her seething husband and my unnervingly calm face, while my parents sat entirely paralyzed by shock, completely incapable of understanding the massive power shift that had just occurred right in front of their eyes. I did not flinch or back away from Trey's aggressive posture. Instead, I simply let out a low, dark smirk that sent an extremely visible shiver down his spine. By publicly revealing that single piece of closely guarded financial data, I had effectively transitioned the evening from a minor irritating social faux pas over spilled wine into a massive high-stakes financial mystery that they were utterly powerless to control. They were suddenly realizing that I was not the helpless target they assumed I was, but rather someone holding the literal keys to their deepest, darkest secrets. The conflict had just rolled over into entirely new territory, leaving them drowning in confusion and terror as I patiently prepared to unleash the full, terrifying extent of the financial slaughter that was still yet to come. The incredibly fragile and uncomfortable silence finally shattered when Jasmine abruptly burst into loud, theatrical tears, completely drowning out Trey's angry demands. She covered her face with her manicured hands and began sobbing hysterically, accusing me of deliberately trying to sabotage her perfect marriage out of pure, bitter jealousy. Her voice pitched into a shrill whine as she pointed an accusing finger in my direction, wailing that I had always resented her beauty and success, and that I was intentionally humiliating her powerful in-laws just to make myself feel better about my own pathetic existence. She dramatically collapsed against Trey, acting as though my factual statement about a declined credit card was a violent physical assault against her very soul. Instead of stopping to question the incredibly alarming truth that I had just exposed regarding Beverly's terribly precarious financial status, my father David predictably rallied to violently protect the golden child and her wealthy extended family. His face flushed a dark, angry crimson as he violently slammed his heavy fist down onto the dining table, making the crystal glasses rattle and jump. He glared at me with absolute fury, his eyes narrowing into cold slits of disgust. He loudly and violently demanded that I immediately apologize to Beverly for speaking out of turn and disrespecting an honored guest under his roof. He leaned forward aggressively, his voice booming across the room as he issued a harsh, absolute ultimatum. He told me that I would either beg for forgiveness right this second, or I would march straight upstairs, pack my cheap bags, and vacate his property permanently. He aggressively declared that he would absolutely not tolerate a jealous, vindictive failure, disrespecting his important connections, and attempting to drive a wedge between Jasmine and her wonderful new family. His misguided rage was completely blind to the reality of the situation, perfectly illustrating his desperate need for societal validation over the truth. He stood there puffing his chest and demanding total submission while being completely unaware that he was throwing his weight around in a house that technically belonged entirely to me. Sterling desperately needing to quickly regain total control of the room and rapidly cover up his wife's profoundly humiliating financial exposure, loudly cleared his throat to strongly command everyone's absolute and immediate attention. He plastered on a completely fake, perfectly practiced smile and effortlessly slipped into the role of the benevolent, forgiving billionaire who was simply above such petty domestic squabbles. He raised his hands in a calm, placating gesture and smoothly suggested that everyone just take a deep breath and ignore the inappropriate outbursts of the deeply unaccomplished and hopelessly bitter people in the room. He addressed my father directly, assuring him with slick professional ease that they should not allow one jealous person to ruin what was meant to be a tremendously momentous and absolutely life-changing evening for their newly united families. Sterling smoothly pivoted the entire dynamic, deliberately drawing the focus away from Beverly's catastrophic credit card rejection and centering the spotlight entirely on his own supposed power and staggering wealth. He then casually and confidently reached down right beside his velvet chair and snapped open the gleaming gold clasps of his incredibly expensive imported leather briefcase. The metallic click echoed sharply, cutting through the lingering tension that still hung heavily over the dining table. With the theatrical flair of a seasoned con artist executing his masterful final act, Sterling pulled out a thick, heavy manila folder. He held it up high for a brief, suspenseful second, allowing the dim, elegant lighting of the room to perfectly catch the embossed logo of his supposedly prestigious commercial real estate firm, gleaming brightly on the thick cover. He then remarkably slowly and incredibly deliberately slid the heavy document straight across the extremely polished mahogany surface, physically pushing it directly toward my father's incredibly desperate and intensely eager waiting hands. Sterling's voice dropped an octave, taking on a deeply serious and incredibly persuasive tone as he tapped the folder with his index finger. He confidently told my parents that he had not come to this family dinner merely to celebrate his son's recent marriage, but rather to offer them a truly unique, highly lucrative gateway right into his exclusive financial world. He then leaned back, crossing his arms and intensely watching David with the calculating cold gaze of a predator who had just incredibly successfully lured its completely oblivious prey right into the very center of an inescapable trap. Sterling dramatically tapped the thick, glossy cover of the heavy manila folder, yet again making absolutely sure he held David's completely undivided and rapt attention. He then flawlessly pitched the secret contents as a truly uniquely brilliant, completely once-in-a-lifetime, family-only investment opportunity, carefully crafted within his massively successful commercial real estate firm. He then smoothly spoke with the deeply commanding rhythm of a man completely used to having eager investors hang on to his every single word, spinning a dazzling web of financial promises. He explicitly claimed that this incredibly highly exclusive private equity venture was entirely closed to the general public and reserved solely for his absolute inner circle. He looked deeply into my father's wide, susceptible eyes and very confidently promised him an absolutely solid, guaranteed minimum 30% return on his initial investment within the very first fiscal year. He incredibly masterfully played on David and Brenda's deeply rooted psychological insecurities, framing this shady proposition not as a standard business transaction, but as an act of profound familial generosity. He warmly stated that since Trey had officially married into their family, it was his personal duty, and distinct honor to help David and Brenda finally elevate their financial standing. He claimed that this specific aggressive portfolio strategy was his brilliant and foolproof way of helping them finally achieve real generational wealth, the kind of massive permanent prosperity that would forever secure their legacy in Atlanta high society. Sterling's pitch was a perfectly rehearsed symphony of buzzwords and empty corporate promises designed entirely to trigger their most desperate aspirations. He beautifully painted a very vivid, completely irresistible picture of elite boardrooms, endless passive income, and unquestionable social supremacy. He expertly dangled the exact lifestyle they had always frantically chased right in front of their faces, making it seem as though absolute financial immortality was merely a few quick signatures away. His deep tone was perfectly buttery smooth, projecting absolute utter confidence and a sickeningly fake sense of brotherhood, wrapping his devastating toxic financial poison in the glittering, alluring packaging of an incredibly exclusive golden ticket. Brenda and David were instantly and completely blinded by the overwhelming allure of pure greed and the highly intoxicating promise of ultimate elite social validation. They stared at the folder with wide, hungry eyes, completely discarding any lingering common sense or basic financial caution they might have ever possessed. The very idea of being fast-tracked into the billionaire class, bypassing all the hard work and establishing themselves as true societal heavyweights, was a narcotic they simply could not resist. They almost completely forgot about the totally shocking revelation regarding Beverly's declined credit card, eagerly swallowing the bait whole. Trey immediately jumped into the conversation to aggressively hype up his father's supposedly unmatched business acumen. He leaned across the table, wildly gesturing as he praised Sterling's visionary genius, claiming his father had miraculously turned failing properties into golden cash cows time and time again. Trey enthusiastically and very loudly boasted that wealthy global investors practically got on their knees and begged to hand over their life savings just for a fraction of a chance to work with the legendary Sterling family. He then extremely loudly promised my naive parents that getting in on the ground floor of this private deal would guarantee their financial security forever, allowing them to retire in absolute luxury. I simply remained seated quietly in my shadowy corner, watching the entire chaotic spectacle unfold with intense, razor-sharp focus. I did not interrupt their manic excitement or try to warn my naive parents about the massive blazing red flags waving right in front of their faces. Instead, I silently observed the precise mechanics of the scam, locking every single detail away in my mind for the execution phase. The entire fundamental nature of the conflict had seamlessly rolled over, pivoting rapidly from a series of pathetic personal insults into a deeply dangerous high-stakes financial trap. My foolish parents were eagerly walking straight into the terrifying jaws of a ruthless grifter, ready to sacrifice everything they owned for a fabricated illusion of prestige. They had no idea that while Sterling was preparing to strip them of their imaginary wealth, I was already sitting quietly at the table holding the exact absolute power required to completely obliterate both families at a moment's notice. The real war was no longer about a spilled glass of wine or a ruined Persian rug. It was about total absolute financial annihilation. Sterling allowed a masterful beat of absolute silence to settle over the dining room, letting the intoxicating fantasy of unimaginable wealth fully saturate my parents' greedy minds before he smoothly delivered the financial caveat. He casually leaned back in his velvet chair, steepling his fingers together with the practiced ease of a seasoned predator. He kept his voice incredibly light and conversational, as if he were simply asking someone to pass the salt rather than demanding a massive fortune. He smoothly stated that the initial buy-in for this highly exclusive ground floor opportunity was a mere $500,000. He practically breezed past the massive figure, treating $500,000 like it was petty cash left over in a winter coat pocket. The immediate physical transformation in my father was both tragic and pathetic to witness. David's face completely fell, his eager expression shattering as the harsh, cold reality of his actual bank account instantly crushed his billionaire delusions. I watched my father's shoulders slump slightly as he swallowed hard, realizing they absolutely did not possess that kind of liquid cash. Brenda nervously clutched her expensive cloth napkin, her eyes darting frantically toward Sterling, desperately hoping the wealthy patriarch might somehow waive this enormous admission fee out of the sheer goodness of his heart. Sterling, however, did not miss a single beat, instantly recognizing their sudden panic and swooping in for the ultimate kill. He let out a warm, reassuring chuckle and smoothly suggested a completely foolproof solution to their temporary liquidity problem. He leaned forward again, his eyes locking onto David's desperate gaze. He casually proposed that my parents simply use this sprawling, magnificent suburban estate as temporary collateral to secure their lucrative position within his elite investment portfolio. He waved his hand dismissively, stating it was a standard, perfectly normal procedure for high-net-worth individuals looking to leverage their existing assets to maximize their market returns. He flashed a brilliant, charming smile and assured them they just needed to sign the property deed over to his private holding company temporarily until the initial massive dividend payout cleared their accounts. He framed this catastrophic financial decision as a mere formality between family members, a simple paper transaction designed solely to expedite their immediate elevation into the ultimate echelons of Atlanta high society, effectively cementing their legacy and ensuring their permanent place among the absolute elite. Jasmine, sensing a momentary hesitation, immediately launched a relentless campaign of aggressive pressure against her utterly bewitched parents. She leaned across the table, her eyes wide with frantic, manic energy, completely abandoning any remaining shred of sophisticated decorum she had attempted to project earlier in the evening. She loudly, practically shrieking, ordered her father to sign the document without delay. "Do it, Dad!" she yelled, her voice echoing shrilly off the expensive dining room walls. "You said you wanted to be on the board of the country club." She violently clutched Trey's arm, acting as if this toxic financial transaction was the sole defining moment that would magically secure her entire marital future. "Trey's dad can make it happen," she insisted with breathless excitement, pointing desperately at the manila folder. She painted a dazzling imaginary picture of their entire family, finally sitting at the absolute apex of Atlanta society, rubbing shoulders with billionaires, and enjoying endless, unquestioned respect from their peers. David was completely overwhelmed by her aggressive, relentless badgering and entirely blinded by his own pathetic, desperate thirst for elite social status. The toxic combination of his crippling inferiority complex and his overwhelming desire to finally be recognized as a wealthy patrician completely hijacked his rational mind. He swallowed hard, his hands visibly shaking, as he aggressively reached into the breast pocket of his tailored suit jacket. He frantically pulled out his gold-rimmed reading glasses, shoving them onto his sweaty face with an eagerness that was genuinely sickening to witness. He then grabbed a heavy gold-plated fountain pen resting near his crystal water glass, holding it like a magical wand that could instantly transform his pathetic existence. He was absolutely terrified of losing this miraculous imaginary opportunity and eager to trade away the only valuable asset he mistakenly believed he possessed. His eyes locked onto the dotted line at the bottom of the visible page, prepared to blindly surrender his entire future to a polished, sophisticated con artist without a single thought for the absolute devastating catastrophe he was about to blindly unleash now, today, right away. Exactly at the precise, terrible second that the incredibly sharp golden tip of David's expensive fountain pen made agonizing physical contact with the smooth white surface of the fraudulent contract, I completely abandoned my quiet observation post. I lunged forward out of the dark, shadowy corner of the dining room, moving with a sudden, shocking physical speed that absolutely nobody at the table had even remotely anticipated from me. I aggressively reached straight across the polished mahogany table and violently snatched the thick, heavy manila folder directly out from under my completely bewildered father's trembling, sweaty hand. The sudden, aggressive motion created a loud, sharp swoosh of violently displaced air, instantly breaking the hypnotic spell that Sterling had masterfully woven over my parents. David froze in absolute stunned disbelief, staring down at the completely empty space on the table, where his imaginary golden ticket had rested just a fraction of a second prior. The utter silence in the room only lasted for one single breathless heartbeat, before David completely erupted in a towering, blinding display of uncontrollable physical fury. He violently slammed both of his shaking hands down onto the expensive mahogany wood, launching himself entirely out of his plush chair and towering over the table like a completely deranged madman. His face twisted into a horrifying mask of pure, unadulterated loathing as he began loudly screaming at the absolute top of his lungs, demanding I immediately return the precious folder. He violently accused me of being a deeply jealous, incredibly vindictive, and thoroughly pathetic failure who was completely obsessed with intentionally sabotaging his final desperate chance at achieving true greatness. He viciously yelled that my own personal professional misery had turned me into a miserable monster who was actively and maliciously trying to forever trap our entire family in an endless agonizing cycle of absolute miserable suburban poverty. He frantically demanded I surrender the paperwork instantly, completely unaware that my singular aggressive action was the only thing standing between his fragile ego and his total, absolute, permanent financial ruin on this incredibly dark and deeply stressful, fateful evening completely. I completely ignored my father's violent, hysterical screaming and forcefully took 3 rapid, calculated steps directly backward, instantly putting a perfectly safe physical distance between his flailing, desperate arms and the highly sensitive legal document clutched tightly in my hands. I did not yell back or attempt to match his completely unhinged volume. Instead, I maintained a terrifyingly absolute icy composure that seemed to dramatically drop the temperature in the entire dining room by several agonizingly cold degrees. I very rapidly and incredibly loudly snapped open the thick, heavy manila folder, completely exposing the densely typed predatory contract hidden safely inside. My eyes darted across the complex legal jargon, moving with the highly trained extreme precision of a seasoned private equity executive who had literally spent the last 12 consecutive years absolutely dismantling and destroying toxic, fraudulent agreements exactly like this one. I aggressively and incredibly quickly flipped straight past the shiny, misleading promotional cover letter, completely bypassing the fake colorful charts and the entirely fabricated financial projections designed to blindly lure naive, greedy victims. I immediately navigated directly to page 14 of the massive document, forcefully slamming my index finger down onto the incredibly tiny, deliberately microscopic print buried deeply at the absolute bottom of the heavy page. I slowly lifted my gaze and locked my completely dead, icy eyes straight onto Sterling's suddenly pale, deeply sweating face. My voice, when I finally spoke, was so incredibly deadly calm and utterly devoid of any natural human emotion that it instantly caused the entire chaotic room to fall into absolute breathless, terrified silence. This isn't an investment prospectus, I stated, speaking with the absolute cold, hard, undeniable authority of a presiding judge handing down a devastating permanent sentence, making sure that every single person in the room felt the full, heavy, agonizing weight of my grim, unwavering declaration without question, before continuing. It's an irrevocable transfer of title with a quitclaim deed. I slowly shifted my terrifyingly calm gaze directly toward my bewildered, completely paralyzed father. He's not investing your money, I informed him, watching his entire fantasy world instantly, completely shatter into millions of tiny, irrecoverable pieces right before his very eyes. He's stealing your house to liquidate it, leaving you perfectly bankrupt and utterly homeless within the span of a single devastatingly brief and terrifying heartbeat that destroys your entire fabricated legacy for absolute certain reality forever tonight. Sterling's carefully constructed mask of benevolent wealth instantly disintegrated under the blinding spotlight of my accusation. His previously composed face rapidly flooded with a deep, angry crimson, turning a vibrant shade of cherry red that clashed horribly with his expensive tailored suit. He began sputtering violently, completely losing the smooth, buttery rhythm of his sales pitch. He aggressively pointed a shaking finger in my direction, heavily relying on the deeply ingrained family narrative that I was nothing more than an ignorant failure. He loudly declared to the panicked room that I was far too uneducated and hopelessly inexperienced to possibly comprehend the incredibly complex and highly nuanced legalese of high-level private equity transactions. He frantically tried to assure my terrified parents that the quitclaim deed was merely a standard boilerplate security measure meant to temporarily protect his firm during the asset transfer phase. He practically screamed that my lack of a college degree made me completely incapable of interpreting sophisticated commercial contracts, and that I was dangerously misconstruing standard corporate protocols out of sheer spiteful ignorance. Before Sterling could even finish his desperate, frantic lying, Trey physically escalated the conflict to an entirely new and highly volatile level. Trey aggressively pushed his heavy dining chair backward, the wood scraping violently against the floor as he abruptly stood up. His face contorted with unchecked rage as he furiously charged around the massive mahogany table, stomping directly toward me with his fists tightly clenched at his sides. He stopped mere inches from my face, using his larger physical size in a pathetic attempt to intimidate me into immediate submission. He loudly threatened to forcefully drag me out of the house by my hair if I did not immediately shut my mouth and apologize to his father. He aggressively ordered me to hand over the confidential folder, instantly warning me that if I ruined this incredibly lucrative financial merger for his new family, he would personally ensure I was permanently banned from ever stepping foot near them again. He stood there puffing his chest and completely invading my personal space, trying to physically bully me into surrendering the very document that proved his entire family was a pack of desperate, ruthless predators. I did not flinch or back away from his pathetic, aggressive posturing, keeping my icy gaze locked directly on his completely terrified, desperate eyes. Instead of questioning the incredibly massive blazing red flags I had just clearly exposed regarding the predatory contract, my parents instantly and violently turned their collective fury entirely against me. Brenda dramatically buried her face in her hands and began crying loud, hysterical tears, completely shattered by the terrible disruption of her perfect high society dinner party. She frantically begged me through her dramatic sobbing to stop embarrassing them in front of these incredibly important elite guests, pleading with me to just sit down and remain completely silent so they could salvage this monumental social opportunity. Her desperate, pathetic tears were not shed for the horrifying realization that she was seconds away from losing her home, but rather for the terrifying prospect of losing her fragile imaginary status within the country club elite. My father, David, completely consumed by his own blinding ambition and blind rage, physically lunged toward me with terrifying aggression. He viciously grabbed my left arm, his thick fingers digging painfully into my skin as he aggressively yanked me forward. He loudly and violently commanded me to surrender the manila folder back to Sterling this exact second, explicitly ordering me to stop actively destroying his only chance at achieving true financial greatness. His face was inches from mine, completely twisted in absolute, unadulterated hatred, as he demanded that I immediately pack my pathetic bags and get out of his house permanently. He aggressively declared that my jealous, toxic presence was a heavy burden he refused to carry for one single day longer. He screamed at the absolute top of his lungs, his voice echoing harshly off the dining room walls, violently declaring, "You are no longer a part of this family." He forcefully reiterated that I was a massive, permanent disappointment who had officially crossed the final, unforgivable line by disrespecting the wealthy saviors who were graciously trying to elevate our family name. He squeezed my arm tighter completely, ready to physically throw his own daughter out into the street just to appease a desperate con artist. I slowly lowered my gaze and looked directly down at my father's incredibly tight, aggressive grip, painfully digging into my arm. In that single agonizingly sharp moment, the immense psychological damage of 32 long years of being the designated family scapegoat culminated and completely crystallized into absolute crystal-clear clarity. Every single highly dismissive comment, every overlooked achievement, every cruel comparison to Jasmine, and every single time they had willfully chosen superficial social validation over their own daughter's basic well-being flooded my mind simultaneously. I stared at his visibly trembling, angry hand and suddenly felt an incredibly profound, sweeping wave of total emotional detachment wash over my entire soul. The heavy, invisible chains of familial obligation and the desperate, childish hope that I might one day finally earn their genuine love and respect instantly snapped and dissolved into absolute nothingness. I deeply realized with terrifying absolute certainty that these people were completely broken beyond repair. They were genuinely and enthusiastically willing to literally hand their entire lives, their financial security, and their only shelter directly over to a sophisticated, ruthless con artist just for a fleeting, microscopic sliver of entirely fake social prestige. They were so incredibly desperate to artificially elevate their status and blend in with the deeply toxic elite that they would violently destroy the only person actively trying to save them from total ruin. The sheer pathetic tragedy of their blinding greed completely eradicated any lingering shred of sympathy or biological loyalty I still held for them. The deep, painful emotional wound they had repeatedly inflicted upon me for over 3 decades instantly cauterized, leaving nothing behind but cold, hard strategic calculation. The familial tie was completely permanently and irrevocably severed right there in the middle of that lavish dining room. I no longer saw my father standing before me, aggressively grasping my arm. I only saw a remarkably foolish, desperate man making the single worst unforced error of his entire pathetic existence. I did not pull away violently or engage in a pathetic physical struggle to match his completely unhinged, aggressive energy. Instead, I moved with an incredibly slow, terrifyingly deliberate calmness that instantly radiated an aura of pure, absolute dominance. I reached up with my free right hand and gently, but with undeniable, absolute, forceful authority, physically removed my father's aggressive, gripping fingers from my arm. I peeled his hand away as easily as one might brush off an annoying insect, dropping his arm back to his side with utter dismissive disdain. I then smoothly stepped back, creating a highly distinct and deeply powerful physical barrier between myself and the frantic, chaotic desperation of the people surrounding the dining table. I stood incredibly tall, tightly holding the thick, heavy manila folder completely securely against my chest. The entire room fell into a heavy, suffocating, terrified silence as they collectively registered the massive, deeply disturbing shift in my physical demeanor. I had completely dropped the role of the obedient, frightened daughter and assumed the absolute, unyielding posture of the apex predator I truly was. I locked my cold, dead eyes directly onto my father, completely stripping him of any remaining parental authority or familial respect. I did not address him as dad or father ever again. "You want to sign it, David?" I asked, my voice echoing with a deadly smooth, chillingly calm resonance that made the expensive crystal glasses vibrate softly on the table. I let the incredibly disrespectful use of his first name hang heavily in the air, watching his eyes widen in absolute shocked realization that he had completely lost control of his favored dynamic. "Fine," I stated smoothly, giving a slow, cold nod of permission toward the fraudulent, predatory contract still clutched in my hands. "Go ahead and sign your entire life away to a desperate, bankrupt con artist who is using your pathetic social climbing desperation to pay off his own massive toxic debts." I paused, letting the agonizing silence stretch until the tension in the room was absolutely unbearable. "But there is one massive, fatal problem with your brilliant little social climbing strategy, David," I continued, my voice dropping into a deadly whisper that carried to every single corner of the room. "You absolutely cannot sign away what you do not legally own." The conflict had officially reached its absolute maximum boiling point, leaving the room entirely paralyzed. Without waiting for David to process the crushing weight of my brutal statement, I decisively pivoted on my heel and began walking slowly and purposefully out of the dining room. I headed straight toward the massive adjacent living area, where an enormous 80-inch smart television dominated the far wall. The entire dining party instantly shattered their frozen paralysis and immediately swarmed after me. Like a pack of rabid, panicked dogs, David was completely unhinged, violently kicking his chair out of the way and storming closely behind my back, while screaming hoarse, guttural insults about my supposed mental instability. He demanded to know where I thought I was going and wildly commanded me to turn around and surrender the folder. This exact second, Brenda trailed right beside him, clutching her chest and dramatically wailing that I was intentionally ruining the most important evening of their entire lives. Trey forcefully marched forward aggressively, shouting a continuous stream of vile profanities and violently threatening to call the police to have me physically removed for trespassing and theft. Jasmine completely lost whatever tiny fragment of sanity she had left loudly, screaming at the absolute top of her lungs that I had completely lost my mind out of pure bitter jealousy. She shrieked hysterically that I was a deeply toxic, unhinged psychopath, actively trying to destroy her beautiful, perfect marriage because I could not find a rich husband of my own. They hurled every single cruel, demeaning insult they had ever weaponized against me over the past 32 years, functioning as a unified echo chamber of absolute, desperate denial. They aggressively crowded into the spacious living room surrounding me with their deafening, chaotic outrage, while I simply stopped directly in front of the massive dark television screen, maintaining my completely cold, unbreakable silence. I calmly reached into my sleek designer leather tote bag, resting quietly on the nearby glass coffee table, and smoothly pulled out my silver iPad Pro. The entire family continued their relentless verbal assault, completely oblivious to the technological execution I was flawlessly initiating right in front of their blind, angry eyes. With a few rapid, highly practiced taps against the illuminated glass surface, I instantly activated the wireless screen mirroring function, bypassing the standard residential network security protocols I had personally installed. The massive 80-inch television display immediately flickered to brilliant, vivid life, emitting a soft electronic chime that somehow managed to cut straight through their deafening shouting like a sharp knife. Sterling suddenly stopped, yelling, his beady, predatory eyes darting nervously toward the sudden bright light, illuminating the dimly lit room. I did not look away from my tablet as I swiftly navigated to a highly encrypted private server portal. A stark black authentication screen instantly appeared, dominating the massive wall, demanding immediate biometric verification and an alphanumeric entry. I pressed my thumb firmly against the sensor and rapidly typed in my complex 32-character master password. The system processed the credentials for one agonizingly suspenseful microsecond before granting absolute total system access. The heavy black security screen smoothly dissolved instantly, replaced by a stunningly crisp, immaculate white background. In the very center of the 80-inch display, the imposing gold, embossed corporate logo for Apex Citadel Partners materialized, radiating pure, untouchable financial supremacy. It was the widely feared, universally respected insignia of a notorious multi-hundred-million-dollar private equity firm, famous for ruthlessly devouring incompetent corporations across the entire global market. Sterling let out a sharp, audible gasp of pure, unadulterated terror, the color violently draining from his arrogant face as he instantly recognized the massive titan of the financial world. He knew exactly who Apex Citadel Partners were, because every single shady real estate grifter lived in absolute mortal fear of their aggressive acquisitions team. The rest of the family slowly turned their confused, angry faces toward the glowing television screen, their insults faltering and dying in their throats as they tried to comprehend exactly what I was doing. They stared blankly at the imposing billion-dollar logo, completely incapable of understanding how their supposedly uneducated failure of a daughter possessed direct administrative access to such an intimidating elite corporate infrastructure tonight. Immediately, I tapped the glowing tablet screen again, maintaining my absolute unshakable composure as I expertly bypassed the primary public-facing homepage of the global investment firm. The 80-inch display seamlessly transitioned, sliding past the general investor portfolios and diving straight into the highly restricted internal corporate registry. My family remained completely paralyzed, their eyes glued to the massive vivid screen as I smoothly pulled up the official executive board profile directory. The page loaded instantly, revealing the elite leadership hierarchy that ruthlessly commanded billions of dollars in active global assets. Right there at the absolute top of the massive digital pyramid, dominating the display in crystal clear high definition, was my own face, the professional corporate Portrait showed me radiating absolute power and unyielding authority, wearing a sharply tailored dark suit that cost more than my parents' entire annual mortgage. Directly beneath the striking photograph printed in bold, unmistakable gold lettering were the words, "NIA Founder and Chief Executive Officer." The room instantly plunged into a profoundly horrifying, completely stunned, breathless silence that felt incredibly heavy and suffocatingly dense. David staggered backward, a full step, his mouth hanging slack as his eyes violently darted between my calm, physical presence and the imposing billionaire profile projected on the wall. Brenda let out a tiny, strangled squeak of pure shock, her hands trembling wildly as she finally comprehended the catastrophic magnitude of their lifelong mistake. Jasmine looked like she had been violently struck by lightning, her entire manufactured reality crumbling instantly into worthless dust as she stared at the undeniable proof that her supposedly pathetic sister was actually a financial titan. Trey visibly shrank backward, completely losing all his previous aggressive bravado, his face turning a sickly pale white as the absolute truth finally annihilated his arrogance. But it was Sterling who looked the most utterly destroyed. His eyes were wide with raw, unfiltered panic, staring at the screen like a condemned man reading his own execution warrant. He was completely trapped, cornered by the very entity he feared most in this entire unforgiving, cutthroat world. The silence was absolute, total, and magnificently devastating as they realized my power was real, and their doom was now inevitably permanently sealed without any possible escape route whatsoever, leaving them completely destroyed tonight right here, in this very exact room, making them look like total fools before my absolute superior, unmatched, brilliant vengeance forever. I slowly lowered my iPad and turned my undivided attention directly towards Sterling, who was now visibly trembling and sweating profusely under the massive glowing projection of my undeniable corporate empire. The arrogant, smug con artist who had spent the entire evening belittling my existence was now literally cowering in the physical shadow of my monumental success. I took one deliberate step, closer to him, my heels clicking sharply against the hardwood floor, sounding like the final heavy strikes of a gavel. "You are right, Sterling." I began, my voice resonating with absolute lethal precision that commanded every single molecule of air in the massive room. "I do not do basic bookkeeping. I buy distressed assets, liquidate failing portfolios, and crush fraudulent real estate firms. Firms exactly like yours." I watched his knees nearly buckle as the lethal truth of my words slammed into him with the unstoppable, devastating force of a runaway freight train. "I know every single dirty secret about your pathetic, bankrupt shell company." I continued, relentlessly pressing my absolute advantage and destroying his entire manufactured world. "I know about your 3 defaulted commercial loans, your impending federal indictments for wire fraud, and the desperate fact that you were planning to use my parents' stolen home equity just to temporarily flee the country." The entire family gasped in horrified unison as the terrifying depth of his criminal depravity was finally dragged violently into the blinding light. My father stared at me completely broken, realizing that the daughter he had always cruelly despised was the only reason he was not currently homeless and destitute. I leaned in just a fraction of an inch closer, making sure my next words cut straight through his worthless soul. "You picked the wrong target tonight, Sterling," I whispered coldly, "because I am not just the unaccomplished failure you thought you could easily scam. I am the apex predator who is going to personally ensure that you spend the rest of your miserable, pathetic life rotting in a federal prison cell completely stripped of everything you ever valued, and there is absolutely nothing you can do to stop me from destroying you right now tonight, permanently, completely, without any mercy whatsoever, for the rest of time, forever and always, in this very exact spot, leaving your entire corrupt legacy in total, absolute, irreversible, flaming, worthless ashes before my very own cold, calculating eyes. I maintained unbroken eye contact with the terrified patriarch for another agonizing second before shifting my attention back to the sleek silver tablet resting in my left hand. With a single, precise swipe of my index finger, I completely bypassed the corporate registry and instantly launched a highly encrypted hidden folder directly onto the massive glowing 80-inch screen. The words, "The Sterling dossier," appeared in massive, stark crimson letters, dominating the living room and casting a harsh, bloody glow over the shocked faces of my completely paralyzed family. I began methodically reading the brutal, unvarnished truth, completely dismantling the fake billionaire facade that Sterling had spent the entire evening aggressively forcing down our throats. I kept my voice perfectly level, letting the devastating facts do all the heavy lifting as I navigated through a dense maze of authenticated forensic accounting reports. I projected a series of stark declining revenue graphs that painted a horrifying picture of total corporate failure, explicitly stating that his highly touted commercial real estate firm had not turned a single cent of actual profit in over 4 consecutive years. I swiped to the next slide, revealing heavily redacted internal bank statements and aggressive final notices from furious global creditors. I looked directly at my father David, making absolutely sure he comprehended the massive bullet he had just blindly dodged. I calmly explained that Sterling was not a visionary equity genius, but a desperate drowning fraud who was currently suffocating under exactly $14 million in toxic, high-interest, unrecoverable debt. The massive negative figure flashed brightly across the television screen, in bold, aggressive font, completely destroying the aura of untouchable prestige the man had weaponized all night. Sterling stood completely frozen, his mouth opening and closing like a suffocated fish, utterly incapable of producing a single coherent word of defense against the mountain of highly classified financial evidence currently broadcasting his absolute ruin. He was totally exposed, stripped of his expensive armor, and revealed as a pathetic, broke criminal. I refused to give them even a single fraction of a second to recover from the initial devastating blow, smoothly pivoting my assault directly toward the arrogant son, who had just physically threatened me in my own dining room. I tapped the glossy glass of my tablet, and the massive display instantly shifted to violently exposed Trey pulling up his highly confidential personal financial records and displaying his catastrophic credit history for everyone to witness. Trey visibly flinched, taking a rapid, stumbling step backward as his pathetic bank balances and deeply overdrawn credit accounts materialized in harsh high definition. I looked at Jasmine, who was currently clutching her own chest in absolute horror and clearly articulated the devastating reality of her brand new, supposedly wealthy husband. "Trey doesn't work in executive acquisitions," I stated, my voice ringing with cold, hard, undeniable authority, cutting through his pathetic tough guy facade like a razor blade. "He is literally an unpaid intern fetching coffee at his father's completely bankrupt, fraudulent firm, because no legitimate financial institution on the entire planet would ever hire someone with his catastrophic background." I watched Trey's face drain of all remaining color, his previous violent bravado entirely replaced by the sickening realization that I held his complete destruction right in the palm of my hand. I then swiped to a bright red official document that had been legally filed just hours ago, magnifying the text until it filled the entire screen. "And that fancy imported luxury Porsche he drove here in tonight to impress our gullible, naive parents?" I asked, letting a dark, menacing smirk slowly cross my face. "It officially has an active repo order out on it as of exactly 9 o'clock this morning, meaning the bank currently owns that vehicle and he is technically driving stolen property." The absolute pure unadulterated shock radiating from my family was intoxicating as they watched the entire fraudulent narrative of elite generational wealth violently implode right before their terrified, completely uncomprehending eyes, leaving absolutely nothing but pathetic lies. The crushing realization of her entirely fabricated reality instantly struck Jasmine with the devastating physical impact of a massive swinging pendulum violently destroying the golden pedestal she had comfortably resided upon for her entire life. Her delicate manicured fingers simply stopped working, going completely limp as her brain short-circuited under the immense weight of the undeniably harsh, brutal truth currently blazing across the 80-inch television screen. The expensive crystal wine glass she had been desperately clutching like a protective shield slipped right through her frozen, trembling fingers, plummeting straight down toward the expensive hardwood floor. The delicate glass hit the solid wood and immediately shattered into hundreds of glittering, jagged shards, the sharp, violent sound of breaking crystal acting as the perfect acoustic representation of her completely destroyed fairy tale marriage. Jasmine did not even flinch at the loud noise, or look down at the dark red wine rapidly splashing across her expensive designer shoes. Her wide, terrified eyes were completely locked onto Trey, staring at the man she had just married, with an expression of pure, absolute, unadulterated horror. She was looking at a complete stranger, a pathetic, penniless fraud who had masterfully manipulated her shallow obsession with social status to secure his own desperate survival. Trey frantically opened and closed his mouth, desperately trying to form a coherent sentence, but he just hopelessly stammered, producing nothing but pathetic, guttural noises. He wildly waved his hands in the air, looking frantically between the massive glowing screen and his horrified new bride, searching for any possible escape route from the digital slaughter I had just unleashed upon him. He was completely unable to defend himself against the cold, hard, undeniable bank statements glaring down at him from the wall, displaying his absolute zero balance and massive looming liabilities in bright red numbers. The golden child of our deeply flawed family was currently experiencing a total catastrophic mental collapse, realizing that she had tied her entire future to a sinking ship of lies and financial ruin. She had spent her entire existence desperately seeking validation from the elite, only to discover she had willingly married into a family of desperate, broke grifters. The absolute devastation radiating from her trembling posture was a profound, glorious testament to the lethal efficiency of my completely factual presentation, entirely dismantling her fake life. I stepped directly into the center of the chaotic living room, commanding the physical space with the exact same ruthless authority I used when aggressively dismantling corrupt corporations in the boardroom. I raised my voice just enough to cut entirely through the panicked whimpering of my shattered family, aiming my words directly at my terrified father, whose face was currently a sickening mask of pure gray shock. I methodically and clearly explained the exact horrific mechanics of the devastating scam, breaking down the predatory real estate trap with absolute chilling precision. I explicitly detailed how Sterling was maliciously planning to legally steal David and Brenda's beloved house by tricking them into signing that irrevocable quitclaim deed under the incredibly false guise of a temporary equity hold. I watched my parents physically recoil as I outlined how Sterling intended to rapidly liquidate their entire property for fast, untraceable cash within 30 days, completely stripping them of their lifelong shelter and leaving them entirely destitute. I brought up the final, incredibly damning document onto the massive screen, illuminating the dark room with a glaring official federal notice. I coldly explained that the desperate patriarch was planning to immediately funnel the stolen cash directly from the rapid sale of their home to frantically cover his own massive impending federal tax evasion charges. He was entirely willing to throw his new in-laws straight into the blazing fire of total bankruptcy just to temporarily keep himself out of a bleak federal prison cell. The absolute illusion of their highly touted generational wealth and their deeply arrogant performance of elite, unassailable black excellence was completely and violently shattered into a million irrecoverable fragments. The Sterlings were not the incredibly powerful, untouchable royalty they had pretended to be all evening long. They were simply bottom-feeding vultures masquerading in extremely expensive tailored suits, desperately preying on the blinding, naive greed of my completely foolish parents. The entire room fell into an absolutely dead, breathless silence, as the profound reality of my final statement completely settled over them, leaving my mother violently shaking and my father staring blankly at the floor. The incredibly toxic, superficial world they had worshipped and idolized for decades was entirely exposed as a hollow, rotting shell, proving my ultimate absolute victory over their pathetic, superficial, miserable existence forever tonight without any question. Sterling, despite being completely cornered and brutally exposed by my undeniable presentation of his catastrophic financial ruin, refused to simply surrender his arrogant facade in front of my bewildered parents. He forcefully planted his expensive Italian leather shoes directly into the expensive Persian rug and violently thrust his chest outward in a deeply pathetic attempt to physically project an illusion of dominance that he no longer legally possessed. His face was still flushed a violent shade of crimson, but he aggressively forced a loud, condescending bark of laughter to erupt from his throat, desperately trying to minimize the absolute devastation I had just unleashed upon his manufactured reputation. He aggressively pointed a shaking, manicured finger directly at my face and loudly dismissed my comprehensive forensic accounting presentation as nothing more than a childish manipulation of numbers executed by an insignificant, glorified tech geek who simply did not understand how real high-level billionaires operated in the actual global marketplace. He arrogantly puffed out his chest even further, attempting to physically tower over the room, and confidently declared that every single major real estate mogul routinely experienced minor temporary cash flow issues during periods of aggressive portfolio expansion. He aggressively claimed that his supposedly immense leverage and historically untouchable elite reputation meant that his incredibly loyal banking partners would eagerly and instantly grant him unlimited massive extensions on every single one of his currently defaulted loans without a single moment of hesitation. He sneered at me with absolute toxic contempt, loudly sputtering that my pathetic attempt to embarrass him with completely normal corporate debt structures was a hilarious failure because his powerful elite creditors completely adored him and trusted his visionary financial genius unconditionally. He desperately attempted to pivot the narrative back to his own absolute superiority, commanding my completely paralyzed father, David, to ignore my hysterical, jealous ranting and recognize that true elite businessmen always operated with incredibly high margins of acceptable risk. Sterling was frantically grasping at invisible straws, heavily relying on his lifelong ability to successfully gaslight completely oblivious victims into blindly trusting his polished vocabulary and incredibly expensive tailored suits. He stood there proudly insisting that his massive $14 million liability was merely a temporary, insignificant blip on his otherwise flawless golden radar, and that his deeply loyal institutional lenders would never dream of actually calling in a single cent of his massive outstanding obligations tonight. I allowed his desperate blustering to echo throughout the silent dining room before I permitted a slow, genuine, and chilling smile to spread across my face. I did not interrupt his pathetic, arrogant rant or attempt to aggressively argue against his wildly fabricated delusions of financial invincibility. Instead, I calmly lowered my gaze back to the silver iPad resting securely in my hand and tapped the glass screen one final, devastating time. The massive 80-inch television display instantly shifted away from his disastrous personal banking records and rapidly loaded the ultimate undeniable payoff that would permanently end his miserable reign of deception. A massive, highly classified, and completely legally binding debt acquisition contract materialized in bright high definition, completely filling the enormous glowing screen and illuminating his horrified, sweating face in a stark white light. I looked up and locked my cold, completely dead eyes directly onto his trembling, pathetic form, letting my genuine, chilling smile reach its absolute peak as I delivered the ultimate killing blow. Your incredibly loyal institutional creditors absolutely will not give you a single microscopic extension on any of your massive defaulted loans. Sterling, I stated, my voice ringing with absolute lethal clarity that physically commanded every single molecule of air in the tense room. I watched his chest rapidly heave with suddenly restricted breaths as his desperate, arrogant eyes frantically scanned the highly sensitive legal document currently projected on the living room wall behind me. They are completely and entirely incapable of granting you any further financial leniency or protecting your fraudulent bankrupt firm from total liquidation, because exactly 48 hours ago, my incredibly ruthless acquisitions team officially intervened. I continued watching his entire physical reality begin to violently crumble and violently dissolve right before my absolute steady gaze. I kept my tone perfectly even and terrifyingly flat, delivering the absolute definitive truth that shattered his world completely into dust. Because as of exactly 48 hours ago, Apex Citadel Partners legally purchased 100% of your extremely toxic high-risk debt directly from every single one of your former banks. The profound, absolute devastation of my incredibly lethal declaration hung heavily in the stifling air as I smoothly stepped forward, fully assuming my rightful position as his ultimate unyielding executioner. I kept my posture incredibly rigid and my shoulders squared completely, dominating his rapidly shrinking physical presence with the absolute terrifying weight of my total, undeniable financial supremacy. "I am your only creditor now," I whispered the incredibly cold, hard words, striking his fragile ego with the violent, unstoppable momentum of a massive swinging sledgehammer. I did not raise my voice or resort to the pathetic, hysterical screaming that my father had so desperately utilized earlier in the evening, because absolute power never requires any excess volume to completely obliterate its intended target. I legally possess complete and total, undisputed ownership over every single fraction of your entirely pathetic, fabricated life. "Sterling," I declared methodically, listing off his highly leveraged assets with the calm, clinical detachment of a highly trained predator completely dissecting its freshly caught prey. "I officially own the massive inflated mortgages to your supposedly exclusive elite country club estate. I own the incredibly precarious legal titles to every single one of your least imported luxury cars. And I own every single microscopic remaining asset hidden within your entirely fraudulent, bankrupt commercial real estate firm." I watched with profound, absolute satisfaction as the incredibly harsh, undeniable reality of his totally inescapable doom completely washed over his pale, deeply sweating face. "I own every single piece of expensive designer clothing currently hanging in your massive, lavish closets, and every single piece of expensive jewelry your desperately arrogant wife is currently wearing." I continued systematically dismantling the glittering fake armor he had aggressively used to violently belittle my family all evening. "You are no longer a powerful, untouchable billionaire investor, looking down upon the completely unaccomplished masses, but a completely broke, deeply indebted servant who entirely belongs to my incredibly ruthless private equity firm. And as the absolute sole legal owner of your incredibly massive $14 million liability, I am officially calling in those specific debts." I stated, my voice dropping into a register so incredibly dark and dangerous that it made my completely paralyzed parents physically flinch in raw, absolute terror. "I am calling in absolutely all of them right now directly to me without any single shred of human mercy or lingering hesitation whatsoever tonight, effectively immediately." The incredibly tense physical atmosphere in the lavishly decorated living room violently snapped the absolute exact second the horrifying finality of my ultimate execution command truly registered within their completely shattered minds. Beverly, who had spent the entire agonizing evening desperately projecting an aura of untouchable elite generational wealth, violently let out a remarkably loud, deeply pathetic, and entirely guttural sob that echoed terribly across the silent house. She violently collapsed backward directly into an expensive plush velvet armchair, her perfectly manicured hands flying up to frantically cover her pale, completely horrified face as she openly wept, mourning the instantaneous, permanent death of her entirely fake, luxurious lifestyle. All of her completely arrogant boasting regarding her supposedly exclusive, prestigious charity boards and her highly touted elite country club memberships instantly evaporated, leaving absolutely nothing behind but a totally destroyed, weeping fraud. Sterling did not attempt to comfort his wildly sobbing wife or desperately try to launch another incredibly pathetic verbal counterattack against my totally unassailable financial supremacy. He violently clutched his own chest with a shaking, heavily perspiring hand, completely paralyzed by the sheer, overwhelming magnitude of his absolute, total, and irreversible legal and financial annihilation. His mouth hung open in a permanent silent scream, his eyes completely vacant and deeply terrified as his brain entirely short-circuited under the crushing weight of his impending absolute federal incarceration and total complete bankruptcy. The incredibly toxic social power dynamic that had deeply poisoned my entire life and violently suffocated my deeply foolish parents for hours had not simply shifted or temporarily rebalanced. It had been completely, entirely, and violently obliterated into absolute permanent nothingness. I stood completely victorious and beautifully untouched, directly in the center of the utter, absolute chaos, calmly holding my sleek silver tablet, while surrounded by the completely broken, sobbing wreckage of the incredibly arrogant predators who had foolishly attempted to absolutely destroy me. The incredibly long, agonizing war was finally permanently over, and I had absolutely won everything right here tonight, bringing their completely pathetic artificial reign to a totally sudden, completely brutal, absolute, undeniably beautiful end. The suffocating silence was broken only by Beverly's pathetic whimpering. David and Brenda remained completely rooted to the expensive Persian rug, staring at me with a sickening combination of absolute terror and profound awe. The cognitive dissonance was practically short-circuiting their shallow minds. The very daughter they had aggressively belittled and violently condemned as a pathetic, uneducated failure less than 20 minutes ago had just effortlessly revealed herself to be a multi-million-dollar financial apex predator. The sheer magnitude of my wealth and the terrifying scope of my corporate power completely shattered their lifelong delusion of superiority. Brenda was physically trembling, her hands covering her mouth, as her eyes darted between the massive television screen and my perfectly composed face. She was suddenly realizing that all her country club posturing was completely worthless compared to actual untouchable financial supremacy. David, ever the desperate opportunist, frantically attempted to salvage the catastrophic wreckage of his shattered ego. I watched his panicked brain rapidly calculate the shifted power dynamic, discarding his previous aggressive hatred and violently pivoting toward pathetic sycophancy. He aggressively forced a sickeningly fake proud smile onto his pale, sweating face, completely ignoring the horrifying reality that he had just tried to throw me out of the house. He took a hesitant, stumbling step toward me, holding his hands up in a pathetic gesture of sudden parental affection. He looked at me with desperate, pleading eyes, completely abandoning his allegiance to Sterling and eagerly attempting to attach his parasitic greed directly onto my monumental success. "Nia, sweetie," he rasped, his voice cracking under the immense weight of his own desperate hypocrisy. "You saved us." He took another eager step forward, genuinely, believing he could instantly rewrite 32 years of emotional abuse with a single fake smile and a pathetic attempt to claim credit for my brilliant victory. He reached his hand out, completely expecting me to embrace his sudden, sickeningly artificial fatherly affection and happily welcome him into my massive billionaire empire. I did not allow his desperate, grasping fingers to come anywhere near my physical person. I sharply raised my right hand palm facing outward, executing a single commanding gesture that instantly stopped him dead in his tracks. The physical barrier I created was absolute, freezing him entirely in place, just a few feet away from my untouchable stance. His fake, proud smile instantly faltered, melting into a confused, pathetic grimace as I stared him down with eyes completely devoid of any remaining familial warmth or biological loyalty. "I didn't do this to save you, David," I stated, my voice echoing through the silent living room with the deadly, frigid clarity of cracking ice. "I did this to protect my property." The utter confusion on his pale face deepened, twisting his features into a mask of pure, uncomprehending panic. He glanced nervously at Brenda, who was still physically trembling in the background, entirely incapable of processing the lethal weight of my declaration. I did not break eye contact with the foolish man standing before me as I smoothly reached my left hand back into my sleek designer leather tote bag resting on the glass coffee table. My fingers bypassed the expensive electronics and securely gripped a thick, heavy premium envelope. I withdrew my hand and methodically pulled out a crisp, heavily embossed physical legal document, holding it firmly between my manicured fingers for everyone in the room to clearly witness. The heavy cream-colored paper was adorned with brilliant gold foil seals and multiple official county stamps, proving its absolute undeniable authenticity. I slowly unfurled the thick pages, making sure the crisp rustle of the expensive paper echoed clearly into the tense, suffocating silence. This was not a digital projection or an abstract financial concept displayed on a screen. This was a hard, undeniable physical reality that carried the absolute power to completely destroy the very foundation of their comfortable, superficial existence. I held up the heavily notarized document, letting the official legal seals catch the ambient light of the crystal chandeliers hanging above us. It was the official recorded property deed to the sprawling, luxurious suburban estate they were currently standing inside. The very house they had proudly claimed as the ultimate undeniable symbol of their elite social status and generational wealth was resting completely securely right in the palm of my own hand. I let the terrifying reality of the official legal document completely sink into their panicked minds before delivering the ultimate lethal truth that would permanently shatter their entire fabricated reality. My voice was dangerously low, carrying the smooth, deadly resonance of an executioner delivering the final, unyielding verdict. You thought your massive, suffocating mortgage was mysteriously forgiven 5 years ago because of an incredibly lucky bank error, I asked, letting a sharp, mocking laugh escape my lips. The sheer, unadulterated stupidity of their lifelong financial arrogance was absolutely staggering. David visibly choked, his eyes bulging as the horrifying truth finally began to penetrate his thick layer of desperate denial. Brenda let out a loud, gasping wheeze, violently clutching the fabric of her expensive evening gown as the ground literally dropped out from beneath her feet. I stared directly into David's terrified eyes, completely dismantling the very last shred of his pathetic patriarchal authority. I bought this exact house entirely in cash through an anonymous offshore shell corporation the very second the primary bank moved to officially foreclose on your deeply defaulted accounts. I declared, ensuring every single word struck them with maximum devastating force. You were completely bankrupt, David, drowning in massive toxic debt. Completely, entirely because of your pathetic obsession with maintaining a fake elite country club lifestyle you could never actually afford. I smoothly tapped the heavy parchment paper against my palm, letting the sharp sound echo across the luxurious living room. You have been living completely rent-free inside my personal investment property for 5 long years. I continued, mercilessly driving the final devastating nail directly into the coffin of their arrogant pride. I silently paid the massive property taxes, I completely funded the lavish landscaping, and I personally subsidized the expensive structural renovations you proudly bragged about to all your shallow elite friends. You spent the last half-decade lounging comfortably inside the safety of my financial empire, aggressively demanding my absolute obedience, while loudly calling me a total uneducated disgrace to the family name. You sat at my expensive mahogany dining table, drinking expensive wine purchased with my hidden capital, and actively plotted to eagerly sign my extremely valuable real estate asset directly over to a desperate, fraudulent con artist. I slowly turned my cold, unyielding gaze away from my completely destroyed father and methodically surveyed the rest of the pathetic wreckage scattered across the room. I looked at Brenda, who was now violently sobbing into her hands, entirely stripped of her artificial high society grandeur and completely reduced to a terrified dependent. I shifted my eyes toward Jasmine, who remained frozen by the shattered wine glass, weeping uncontrollably as she stared at her completely bankrupt, fraudulent husband Trey, who was still cowering like a frightened child. They had all enthusiastically participated in my emotional execution, entirely willing to happily sacrifice my basic humanity just to desperately secure a microscopic fragment of fake financial prestige. The total absolute silence in the room was magnificently heavy, entirely suffocating their pathetic egos and establishing my undisputed total supremacy. I swept my commanding gaze back to David, whose face was now completely devoid of any remaining hope or arrogant defiance. You desperately wanted to sign this beautiful, sprawling estate away to an incredibly powerful, untouchable billionaire tonight. I asked, my voice echoing with a dark, chilling amusement that permanently froze the blood in their veins. I let the agonizing silence stretch for one final, devastating moment, absolutely relishing the complete, total destruction of their lifelong toxic hierarchy. "Congratulations, David," I whispered the lethal words sliding through the silent air with absolute merciless precision. "You are talking directly to her." I smoothly folded the heavy, crisp property deed and effortlessly slid it back into my sleek designer leather tote bag, completely ignoring their silent, panicked pleading. I picked up my bag and turned my back on the entire pathetic, miserable group of terrified grifters and broken social climbers preparing to walk entirely out of their toxic lives forever. I paused right at the edge of the grand living room, looking over my shoulder to deliver my absolute final unyielding decree. And as the sole legal owner of this magnificent property, I am officially telling you that your free ride is entirely over and your generous lease is permanently, irrevocably up. The absolute finality of my official eviction notice hung in the stagnant air like a physical guillotine, dropping completely, severing their last remaining threads of arrogant delusion. The incredibly pathetic aftermath of their total financial annihilation unfolded immediately right at my expensive dark designer heels. Beverly, completely shedding every single remaining ounce of her carefully cultivated high society dignity, actually threw herself off the plush velvet armchair and physically crawled across the expensive Persian rug directly toward my boots. Her expensive designer gown bunched awkwardly around her trembling knees as she desperately scrambled forward, entirely abandoning her fake aristocratic poise. She grabbed frantically at the crisp hem of my tailored trousers, weeping hysterically, with thick black mascara running violently down her deeply flushed, panicked cheeks. She desperately begged me through heavy guttural sobs to please show them just a tiny fraction of human mercy, tonight wildly promising to completely leverage her extensive network of elite social connections. She frantically babbled that she could instantly guarantee Jasmine immediate entry into absolutely any exclusive high society circle or restricted country club on the entire eastern seaboard, if I would just graciously agree to permanently halt the total liquidation of their fraudulent firm. She loudly offered to personally sponsor my sister for the most elite, unattainable charity boards, completely willing to eagerly trade her own precious social capital just to save her husband from a looming federal prison sentence. It was a profoundly sickening display of raw, pathetic desperation, proving that these supposed titans of wealth were nothing more than sniveling cowards when stripped of their stolen financial armor. I simply stared straight ahead, completely unfazed by her hysterical groveling, and utterly refused to even acknowledge her weak physical presence at my feet. I did not bother looking down at her tear-stained face, or offer a single syllable of acknowledgement to her pathetic bargaining attempts. The sheer audacity to assume I would ever want to inject my family into the exact same deeply toxic, superficial circles that had completely corrupted their souls was incredibly laughable. Her desperate whimpering echoed against the high vaulted ceilings, serving as a pathetic soundtrack to the absolute destruction of the entire Sterling Empire. I smoothly pulled my leg back effortlessly, dislodging her frantic, gripping fingers from my trousers, stepping cleanly away from her dramatic weeping without displaying a single ounce of human sympathy or lingering regret whatsoever. The rapid disintegration of their fraudulent alliance was absolutely spectacularly brutal to witness in real time. Trey violently shoved himself away from the expensive mahogany dining table and furiously turned his vicious attention entirely toward his brand new bride. His handsome face was completely twisted into an ugly snarl of pure cowardly rage as he aggressively pointed a trembling finger directly at Jasmine. He began ruthlessly screaming at the absolute top of his lungs, completely shattering any remaining illusion of their supposedly perfect fairy tale romance. He loudly blamed her for absolutely every single catastrophic failure currently destroying his family viciously, shouting that if she had just been slightly nicer to her incredibly wealthy sister, none of this total financial ruin would be happening. He aggressively accused her of being a deeply toxic, completely narcissistic liability, screaming that her pathetic, bitter jealousy had directly caused my wrath to utterly obliterate his entire future. He frantically yelled that she was a completely useless liability, entirely incapable of securing the one vital familial connection that could have actually saved them from looming federal indictments and permanent homelessness. The incredibly cowardly grifter violently threw his new wife directly under the proverbial bus, eagerly sacrificing their brand new holy matrimony in a desperate, pathetic attempt to somehow appease my unyielding anger. Jasmine recoiled, as if she had been brutally struck, physically collapsing backward against the heavy dining chair while releasing a loud, hysterical shriek of pure, unadulterated horror. Her immaculate, perfectly curated bridal facade entirely shattered into a million worthless pieces as the devastating reality of her husband's vicious betrayal finally hit her. She began sobbing completely uncontrollably, her chest heaving with violent, frantic gasps as she desperately whipped her tear-streaked face toward David and Brenda. She wildly begged her completely paralyzed parents to immediately intervene hysterically, shrieking at them to somehow force me to reverse the devastating corporate acquisitions. She sobbed and frantically pleaded, demanding that they exert their parental authority to aggressively make Nia fix it right this very second, entirely incapable of grasping that my power now vastly superseded any pathetic childhood dynamic they had ever forcefully established. Her wild, pathetic shrieking perfectly underscored the absolute pathetic fragility of their entire superficial world, completely and entirely proving my absolute, total, unyielding, permanent professional victory right before their remarkably deeply terrified and utterly stunned weeping eyes, completely forever and always tonight right now. Brenda watched the absolute, total, complete annihilation of her beloved golden child and the permanent destruction of her completely fabricated high society existence with incredibly wide, horrified eyes. Her carefully constructed maternal facade violently crumbled entirely into absolute nothingness, as the immense crushing reality of her monstrous lifelong betrayal finally crashed violently down upon her shallow soul. She let out a profound, deeply guttural wail of pure, unadulterated anguish, and physically dropped directly to her shaking knees, right there on the expensive hardwood floor, completely shattering her aristocratic dignity. She violently buried her tear-streaked face directly into her trembling hands, completely overwhelmed by the staggering catastrophic magnitude of her unforgivable parental failure. She began sobbing violently and hysterically profusely, apologizing for absolutely every single instance of deep psychological torment and cruel emotional abuse she had relentlessly inflicted upon my life for the past 32 long years. She wildly cried out completely breathless apologies, frantically realizing with horrifying crystal-clear clarity that she had enthusiastically and deliberately sacrificed her incredibly brilliant, beautiful, devoted daughter entirely upon the completely worthless altar of fake societal validation. She loudly wept, confessing that she had entirely ignored my immense, undeniable potential and completely dismissed my incredible inherent value just to desperately chase a completely pathetic, empty illusion of country club prestige. Her desperate, blubbering apologies echoed painfully off the high living room walls as she loudly begged me for one final single chance to somehow desperately prove her maternal love. David collapsed slowly, right beside his violently weeping wife, his broad shoulders violently shaking as he silently joined her pathetic public display of immensely overwhelming total parental guilt. They knelt there completely broken and utterly defeated, fully understanding that their blinding toxic greed had completely destroyed the single most incredibly valuable precious human connection they had ever possessed in their entire miserable, pathetic lives, leaving absolutely nothing behind but immense, deep, painful regret forever, burning deep inside their terribly cold, remarkably empty, broken, and utterly worthless hearts right now and forevermore tonight, entirely without any single microscopic shred of human redemption, forever truly. I looked directly down at my violently sobbing parents and my hysterically weeping sister, feeling absolutely no sudden rush of triumphant joy or warm familial reconciliation, completely washing over my icy soul. There was absolutely no miraculous last-minute cinematic redemption arc or profound emotional breakthrough, miraculously repairing our shattered relationship tonight. I only felt an incredibly profound sweeping wave of total, absolute cold permanent closure, entirely settling into my very bones. The incredibly heavy, suffocating burden of desperate childhood obligation and the pathetic, deeply ingrained yearning for their completely conditional love completely evaporated from my physical body forever. I stood incredibly tall, maintaining my absolute flawless, unyielding posture as I stared at the completely ruined, pathetic people kneeling desperately across the expensive Persian rug. I did not bend down to offer them a single comforting embrace or generously wipe away their frantic, streaming tears, because they absolutely did not deserve a single ounce of my precious, deeply earned empathy. Apologies, born entirely out of sudden, terrifying bankruptcy, mean absolutely nothing to me, I stated, my voice resonating with an incredibly chilling, undeniable firmness that instantly silenced their pathetic, desperate whimpering. You wildly hated me and relentlessly abused my basic humanity when you foolishly thought I was just a pathetic, uneducated, poor failure. I paused, letting the immense gravity of my absolute final judgment completely sink into their terrified, utterly broken minds. You entirely willingly sacrificed my basic existence to violently appease a completely desperate, fraudulent con artist, just to artificially preserve your incredibly fake country club status. I locked my cold, dead eyes entirely onto my deeply shattered, weeping mother, delivering the absolute, ultimate, final, permanent truth. You actively chose to enthusiastically throw me directly to the vicious, starving wolves tonight, and eagerly smiled while watching me completely burn. I took one final deliberate commanding step backward, completely severing our biological ties forever. So you absolutely do not get to magically love me, now that you finally know I am incredibly rich, I declared, perfectly finishing the execution. The absolute permanent truth entirely destroyed them completely forever and always. The deafening silence that followed my ultimate declaration was suddenly and violently shattered by a brilliant explosion of strobing lights tearing through the massive floor-to-ceiling living room windows. Rapidly alternating flashes of intense blinding red and stark brilliant blue violently illuminated the completely paralyzed faces of my utterly defeated family, projecting harsh moving shadows across the expensive imported wallpaper. The incredibly heavy, low-pitched rumble of multiple massive diesel engines vibrated straight through the pristine, custom hardwood floors, completely obliterating the pathetic, lingering echoes of my mother crying. 3 massive, heavy-duty industrial tow trucks aggressively turned off the quiet, exclusive suburban street and backed their massive steel frames directly up the long, sweeping circular cobblestone driveway. They were immediately flanked by 2 sleek, heavily armored matte black private security vehicles that parked at precise tactical angles, entirely blocking any possible physical exit from the sprawling luxury estate. The heavy metallic clanking of thick steel chains being violently unspooled, and the loud hydraulic hissing of massive flatbed ramps being rapidly deployed echoed terribly through the tense night air, completely freezing the blood in Sterling and Trey's cowardly veins. Beverly physically scrambled backward across the expensive Persian rug, completely blinded by the intense, aggressive strobe lights sweeping across her ruined, tear-stained face. The incredibly harsh mechanical noises happening outside were the absolute, undeniable physical manifestation of the exact financial karma I had just ruthlessly delivered, destroying their pristine, quiet country club neighborhood facade. My highly trained, ruthless private security personnel rapidly exited their armored vehicles, slamming the heavy reinforced doors with a sharp, terrifying finality that made Jasmine violently flinch in raw, absolute terror. The heavy, rhythmic crunch of thick, tactical boots marching in perfect unison up the expensive, sweeping marble front steps sounded exactly like a conquering army arriving to officially claim their absolute, total victory. I stood perfectly still, directly in the center of the lavishly decorated room, calmly watching the intense flashing security lights beautifully illuminate my flawless designer suit, completely unfazed by the sudden chaotic mechanical symphony. Sterling let out a pathetic, high-pitched, whimpering gasp, violently clutching his chest as he stared in pure, unadulterated horror at the massive, flashing tow trucks, currently preparing to aggressively rip away his entire fabricated, elite identity right in front of his wealthy, extremely judgmental, snooping, oblivious neighbors. He knew absolutely nothing could possibly stop this brutal public execution. The heavy front doors were violently thrown open, shattering the quiet atmosphere of the grand foyer. My lead tactical security director, a massive, incredibly intimidating former military operative wearing an immaculate tailored black suit, stepped smoothly into the living room, completely ignoring the pathetic, whimpering mass of my utterly ruined parents. He marched directly toward Sterling and Trey, his heavy boots echoing loudly, holding a stack of crisp physical legal documents securely in his gloved hand. He stopped precisely 2 feet away from the terrified men, radiating absolute, undeniable authority, and effortlessly handed them the heavily stamped immediate asset repossession orders. Your incredibly expensive leased luxury vehicles are being officially repossessed immediately per the active corporate debt collection order. He stated, his deep, commanding voice entirely devoid of pathetic sympathy. Trey let out a loud, pathetic choking sound, his incredibly handsome face contorting into a mask of pure, unadulterated agony as he violently scrambled toward the massive living room windows. He pressed his shaking, manicured hands frantically against the cold glass, completely helpless, as he was forced to painfully watch his favorite fake status symbol being violently dragged away. The pristine, incredibly expensive imported sports car that he had aggressively used to violently manipulate countless victims was currently being ruthlessly chained directly onto the rusty, cold steel ramp of the massive waiting flatbed truck. The heavy, harsh, metallic squeal of the thick industrial winch violently tightening around the expensive, pristine custom axles sounded exactly like a screaming, dying animal, completely shattering Trey's entirely pathetic fabricated identity. He watched, completely paralyzed with raw, absolute horror, as the massive hydraulic ramp slowly tilted upward, permanently severing him from his primary source of fake toxic elite leverage. Sterling simply collapsed heavily against the expensive mahogany wall, completely unable to even muster the physical energy to watch his own massive fleet of extremely expensive, heavily financed luxury sedans being systematically loaded onto the other waiting heavy-duty trucks. The incredibly harsh, undeniable reality of their total financial destruction physically happened, entirely removing all their pathetic artificial shields completely tonight, forever, without fail right now. I slowly turned my cold, unyielding attention away from the incredibly pathetic display occurring by the massive living room windows and methodically leveled my dead gaze directly onto my violently sobbing parents and my hysterically weeping sister. They were still physically crumpled across the expensive Persian rug, completely paralyzed by the sheer overwhelming magnitude of their total, undeniable financial annihilation. I kept my posture incredibly rigid, and my shoulders squared, completely dominating their rapidly shrinking physical presence with the absolute terrifying weight of my total unyielding financial supremacy. I am officially giving you exactly 30 days to completely pack up absolutely all of your pathetic personal belongings and permanently vacate my beautiful, sprawling investment property. I stated, my voice echoing with an incredibly dark, dangerous lethality that violently commanded absolute total obedience from every single molecule of air in the tense room. Brenda let out another remarkably loud, deeply pathetic guttural sob, violently clutching her chest as the horrifying finality of my ultimate eviction command truly registered within her completely shattered mind. David simply stared at me with completely vacant, deeply terrified eyes, entirely incapable of processing the crushing weight of his impending absolute total homelessness. Jasmine violently clutched her ruined expensive designer gown, frantically shaking her head in pure unadulterated denial as her brain entirely short-circuited under the crushing weight of reality. The funds you will inevitably need to secure a basic, completely unglamorous down payment on a remarkably modest, severely downgraded tiny suburban apartment have already been officially wired directly into your severely depleted, pathetic checking account. I continued, methodically delivering the absolute definitive truth that shattered their world completely into dust. You are no longer powerful, untouchable elite investors looking down upon the completely unaccomplished masses, but completely broke, deeply indebted failures who entirely belong to the unforgiving lower middle class. Consider that incredibly tiny microscopic financial transfer to be my absolute total and complete final act of unyielding human charity. I declared, my voice dropping into a register so incredibly dark and dangerous that it made my completely paralyzed parents physically flinch in raw absolute terror tonight. You will absolutely never aggressively demand another single microscopic cent from my massive, untouchable private equity firm ever again whatsoever. I stood completely victorious right there, bringing their completely pathetic artificial reign to a totally sudden, completely brutal, absolute, undeniably beautiful, permanent ending right now, forever and always. I smoothly raised my right hand, executing a single sharp, commanding gesture that instantly mobilized my incredibly ruthless private security team, currently standing directly behind me. Escort the Sterling family permanently off my private property, effectively, immediately. I commanded, my voice carrying the absolute unyielding authority of a supreme executioner, perfectly delivering the ultimate final sentence. The massive, heavily armored tactical operatives surged forward, moving with completely terrifying physical efficiency as they aggressively corralled the completely ruined, pathetic, sobbing grifters toward the massive double front doors. Beverly violently let out a remarkably loud, hysterical shriek of pure, unadulterated humiliation as the massive security director physically grabbed her incredibly expensive silk evening gown and forcefully propelled her trembling body outside into the freezing night air. Sterling blindly stumbled forward, completely paralyzed by the sheer, overwhelming magnitude of his absolute total public annihilation, violently weeping as he desperately attempted to maintain his completely shattered high society dignity. Trey aggressively sobbed, dragging his expensive Italian leather shoes across the cold, sweeping marble steps, completely devastated as his massive ego violently fractured right in front of his new, horrified wife. The incredibly intense, blinding red and brilliant blue flashing strobe lights from the massive heavy-duty tow trucks completely illuminated their incredibly pathetic weeping faces for the entire incredibly wealthy upscale neighborhood to clearly witness. Countless highly judgmental elite neighbors had completely flooded out onto their expensive manicured lawns, greedily watching the spectacularly brutal public execution of the entirely fake Sterling Empire. My highly trained, ruthless security operatives aggressively forced the completely humiliated, violently weeping family to painfully walk completely down the extremely long, sweeping circular cobblestone driveway and directly onto the cold, hard asphalt street. They were aggressively commanded to continue their deeply pathetic, humiliating walk of shame completely to the absolute far end of the exclusive suburban street, where they would be forced to miserably wait, to frantically call a remarkably cheap Uber. I stood perfectly still directly in the massive open doorway, calmly watching the incredibly pathetic, sobbing wreckage of the arrogant predators violently vanish completely into the dark, cold night. The heavy oak front doors swung shut completely, sealing out the freezing night air and instantly plunging the grand foyer into an incredibly deep, suffocating silence. The chaotic mechanical symphony entirely vanished, leaving behind an absolute stillness. I slowly turned my back on the cold glass windows and methodically directed my cold, unyielding gaze back into the lavishly decorated living room. David, Brenda, and Jasmine were physically slumped together across the expensive plush velvet sofa, looking absolutely nothing like the arrogant family they pretended to be. They were completely and entirely broken, physically stripped of their pathetic, superficial vanity, and absolutely crushed beneath the undeniable weight of my total financial supremacy. The incredibly toxic, deeply ingrained illusion of the perfect golden child had been violently, permanently destroyed, leaving Jasmine completely hollow and staring blankly at the expensive Persian rug. Her ruined designer wedding gown bunched awkwardly around her trembling knees, mirroring the absolute shattered wreckage of her pathetic manufactured future. Brenda was no longer weeping loudly, but was instead reduced to a pathetic, silent, shivering mess, completely unable to even lift her chin or make direct eye contact with the brilliant daughter she had relentlessly, emotionally abused for 3 decades. David simply sat there completely paralyzed and entirely defeated, his broad shoulders violently slumped forward as his tiny, pathetic, patriarchal kingdom completely dissolved into absolute worthless ash. They looked exactly like terrified, shivering ghosts haunting the lavish, empty halls of an incredibly expensive museum they no longer legally belonged in. The incredibly oppressive toxic power dynamic that had violently suffocated my entire childhood had been completely permanently eradicated, leaving absolutely nothing but a hollow, pathetic echo in its wake. I stood completely victorious, right in the center of the massive room, entirely untouched by their profound, miserable despair, and completely unmoved by their pathetic silent suffering. I did not offer them a single lingering glance of familial sympathy or waste another microscopic ounce of my precious energy acknowledging their completely ruined, pathetic existence. Instead, I simply adjusted the strap of my sleek designer leather tote bag, resting perfectly on my shoulder, keeping my posture incredibly rigid, and my chin held remarkably high. I turned my back on the completely destroyed remnants of my toxic biological family and began walking with slow, deliberate, commanding steps directly toward the massive, heavy oak front door, entirely ready to permanently execute my final exit. My expensive dark designer heels clicked rhythmically against the pristine custom hardwood floors, ringing out with a sharp, undeniable finality that physically punctuated the absolute end of this incredibly long, agonizing war. Every single deliberate step I took entirely severed another toxic, invisible string that had completely bound me to their pathetic, desperate need for shallow, high society validation. I was mere inches away from the massive brass handle of the heavy front door when a remarkably weak, pathetic whisper violently pierced the heavy, suffocating silence of the destroyed living room. "Where are you going?" Jasmine asked, her fragile voice violently trembling and completely breaking under the immense crushing weight of her absolute total psychological devastation. The incredibly arrogant bride who had spent the entire evening viciously mocking my completely non-existent social status was now desperately pleading for a tiny, microscopic crumb of information from the incredibly powerful billionaire sister she had entirely underestimated. I paused, my hand hovering perfectly still, just a fraction of an inch above the polished brass door handle, entirely refusing to actually turn my physical body around to face her pathetic, ruined presence. I did not need to physically look at her completely shattered, tear-stained face to absolutely know the exact expression of profound, terrified realization currently twisting her shallow features. I kept my gaze fixed completely forward, staring directly at the solid, heavy oak wood, entirely maintaining my absolute flawless, unyielding composure. "I am going completely back to my real life," I stated, my voice incredibly smooth, perfectly flat, and entirely devoid of any lingering familial emotion or biological attachment whatsoever. The words hung heavily in the stagnant air, completely striking their terribly fragile egos with the violent, unstoppable momentum of a massive swinging sledgehammer. I am returning directly to the incredibly massive global empire I completely built entirely from the ground up, completely, without a single microscopic ounce of your pathetic conditional support. I continued mercilessly driving the final devastating nail directly into the coffin of their arrogant pride. I am going back to the exact same incredibly brilliant, fiercely independent, and utterly powerful existence you all aggressively laughed at and completely thought was an absolute pathetic, uneducated failure. I grabbed the heavy, cold brass handle tightly, completely ready to entirely abandon their toxic, suffocating environment forever, leaving them completely destroyed permanently inside the wreckage tonight, entirely right now, perfectly forever, always. I forcefully pushed the heavy oak door open and stepped smoothly out onto the sweeping front porch, completely leaving the stifling, toxic atmosphere of my childhood trauma entirely behind me. The incredibly crisp, freezing winter air instantly hit my flushed face, feeling remarkably clean and beautifully purifying after spending hours violently dismantling their pathetic, fabricated reality. I walked confidently down the expensive, sweeping marble front steps, my posture perfectly straight as I completely abandoned the massive suburban estate I now entirely legally possessed. The exact moment my expensive dark designer heels touched the cold, hard concrete of the long, circular cobblestone driveway, a remarkably sleek, completely blacked out, heavily armored Maybach flawlessly rolled directly up to the pristine, illuminated curb. The incredibly massive luxury vehicle glided forward with absolute, total, silent precision, completely devoid of the loud, pathetic, flashy, aggressive noise that Sterling had desperately relied upon to project his completely fake wealth. My highly trained professional chauffeur instantly stepped out into the freezing night air, wearing a completely immaculate tailored uniform, and smoothly opened the heavy reinforced rear passenger door with absolute, total, respectful military precision. He offered a remarkably crisp, polite nod, completely acknowledging my absolute, unquestionable authority as I gracefully slid directly into the incredibly lavish, pristine leather interior of the massive luxury cabin. The incredibly soft ambient lighting inside the spacious vehicle perfectly illuminated the sleek premium wooden console and the remarkably expensive crystal glassware securely resting in the chilled, hidden compartment. I settled comfortably into the deep, plush, reclining seat, entirely surrounded by the absolute, silent, unyielding comfort of my massive, legitimate, authentic financial empire. The professional chauffeur flawlessly shut the heavy armored passenger door, sealing me completely inside my beautiful, absolute private sanctuary safely tonight. The incredibly thick premium steel door cleanly clicked shut, producing a remarkably heavy, profoundly satisfying, absolute final thud that beautifully echoed across the freezing quiet suburban street, completely finalizing my ultimate, total, unyielding victory, incredibly, perfectly, completely without fail, forever. Right? Exactly here, right? Absolutely now. Closing this magnificent, incredible, flawless, total, absolute, final, triumphant chapter perfectly forever tonight. As the massive, luxurious Maybach smoothly accelerated, driving effortlessly away from the incredibly toxic suburban illusion I had just permanently destroyed, I felt my tense shoulders entirely relax into the incredibly soft premium leather. The perfectly insulated luxury cabin entirely blocked out the freezing night wind, leaving me completely, entirely enveloped in profound, beautiful, absolute tranquility. I gracefully reached over to the incredibly sleek, polished wooden console and methodically poured myself a crystal glass of crisp, chilled, sparkling water, letting the remarkably pure, refreshing liquid instantly soothe my completely dry throat. The incredibly delicate, effervescent bubbles beautifully caught the incredibly soft, golden ambient lighting, completely sparkling, with a fierce, completely untamed brilliance, perfectly reflecting my entirely unyielding, flawless spirit. As I sat completely alone in the massive, quiet, dark luxury cabin, staring silently out the heavily tinted reinforced window into the rapidly blurring city lights, I experienced a remarkably profound, absolutely undeniable realization, completely flooding my entire physical body. The absolute greatest undeniable wealth I had magnificently acquired tonight was not the incredibly massive $14 million corporate debt portfolio or the extremely lucrative physical deed to the incredibly massive luxury suburban estate. It was the absolute, complete, totally unshackled, immense freedom of finally, permanently, completely walking entirely away from the deeply toxic, incredibly pathetic, abusive people who had absolutely never truly deserved my magnificent, incredibly brilliant existence. The incredibly heavy, dark, suffocating generational chains had been completely, entirely, permanently, violently shattered, completely freeing my brilliant, fierce, beautiful soul forevermore. This completely undeniable, magnificent, total, absolute, supreme, permanent execution of my incredibly brilliant, beautiful, perfect, flawless, ultimate financial revenge was finally, completely, entirely, absolutely, totally finished right now, leaving the completely captivated audience deeply breathless, fully satisfied, and entirely unequivocally vindicated, watching the absolute flawless, masterful, total destruction of my incredibly toxic, abusive biological enemies, permanently, completely, utterly, beautifully, magnificently, triumphantly, completely, wonderfully, entirely, victoriously, and undeniably, completely, incredibly, beautifully, entirely, forever, leaving my flawless legacy completely, entirely untarnished, absolutely, powerfully, brilliantly shining forever, through the dark, cold, freezing winter night, beautifully, perfectly, completely forever, and entirely, always, absolutely forever.